Hi, so in this video we'll be talking about frogs. So we'll move on to our PowerPoint for our experiment 7. So here we have our PowerPoint now. So we will be talking about the external and internal anatomy of the toad. So in our presentation we will talk about the differences of a frog and a toad, the difference between a male and a female toad, the external body parts of a toad, and the internal body parts of a toad. So starting with the difference between a frog and a toad, we have here a list of their differences with their characteristics. To define first, a frog is actually an amphibian which belongs to the order Anura, and a toad is a frog-like amphibian that belongs to the same order. So amphibians are a group of animals that live partly in fresh water and on land. They have moist skin, no external scales, a head and a trunk joined in a broad depressed body, no tail, short forelimbs, and long hind limbs, and they have exposed eardrums. So in terms of the skin for frogs and toads, frogs actually have smooth, shiny, permeable, slimy skin, while toads have rough, dry, and leathery skin with warts. While frogs' habitats are semi-aquatic, meaning they need to live near water, while as for toads, they can adapt to stay without water compared to frogs, and they only come to water during breeding season. That's why they can stay both in land and water. In terms of the size of a frog and a toad, their bodies, for frogs, they have narrow body and a narrow waist, while toads have a broader and puffy body, a much wider body. In terms of parts, frogs have longer hind legs for hopping and for swimming, so their legs are meant for long jumps, while toads have shorter hind legs that are meant for walking rather than hopping. In terms of their toes, frogs have webbed toes and toads have separated toes, and their eyes are bulged out, and toads do not have bulged out eyes because they have poison behind their eyes. In terms of their jaws, frogs have teeth and toads do not have teeth. Moving on to our next slide, we will now tell the difference between a male and female toad in terms of their external body parts. So we have 3 characteristics that would help us distinguish male or female toads. And here we have the most reliable characteristic that would always be there when the rest of the characteristics fail to show. So for our first one, we have the first finger of a male is very much swollen during breeding season. So here we can see that if we compare a male and female's first finger, the male's is much more swollen compared to the female's here. So this one is actually a male. This is because the males need their fingers to be swollen for them to be able to grasp the female during amplexus. So for our second one, males have dark pigmented areas at the angles of the lower jaw and the ventral surface of the head. This is the most evident characteristic when the rest of them fail to show, and the last one is the female is generally bigger. So here we have a female and a male. Moving on to our next discussion, we have the external body parts of a toad. So we have an overview of what we will be talking about. We have the eggshell and appendicular region, which is subdivided or composed of the head and the trunk, and appendicular we have the forelimbs and hind limbs. So for our eggshell region, again, it is composed of the head and the trunk. First, we will be talking about the head. So the head is also further divided into different parts. We have the snout, external nares or nostrils, the eyes, the tympanic membrane or eardrum, and the brow spot. Here, we have the eggshell region, the head, This whole thing is the head of the toad. Moving on to the parts of the head, we have the snout. So the snout is triangular in shape and found at the anterior end of the head. So this is the snout. And the function of the snout is actually where the external nares or where its nostrils are being placed. Here, another picture, we have a snout. Moving on. Next, we have the external nares or nostrils. These are the two small openings near the tip of the snout, and they are used for breathing. Here, the nostrils. Next, we have eyes. Just like how we humans have eyes that are used to see, toads too have eyes. For the toads, they have upper and lower eyelids. Upper and lower eyelid. And they also have a nictitating membrane. This nictitating membrane is the transparent covering which is the outgrowth of the lower lid, the lower eyelid, and functions by lubricating the eye. Next, we have the tympanic membrane or the eardrum, which is a circular area behind each of the eye, and it functions by when it transmits sound waves to the middle ear and inner ear, it allows them to hear sound both on air and underwater. So this is the tympanum or the tympanic membrane. Next, we have the brow spot. The brow spot is actually quite distinct in frogs, and this is a tiny white spot at the mid-dorsal part of the head between the level of the eye. So here we have the brow spot. So we now finish the first half of the axial region, the head. We will now move on to the trunk. So the trunk, this is actually posterior to the head since it has the anterior part. The trunk is divided again into two regions, the thoracic chest region and the abdominal lumbar region. The thoracic chest region being the anterior part and the abdominal and lumbar region being the posterior half. So here we have the trunk. This lower half is the trunk. So moving on, we will go to the thoracic region, the thoracic chest region, which again is also has other parts, which is the poison and the parotid gland. The poison and parotid gland is the elevated structure behind the tympanum, again behind the eardrum, which functions by moistening the toad's mouth, and it also contains poison which can be used against other predators. So here we have the parotid gland behind the tympanum, and over here we have the parotid gland. Next, we have the abdominal or lumbar region. The abdominal and lumbar region is the posterior half again, and actually, the abdominal is actually the ventral side, while the lumbar region is the dorsal side of the frog. So this side is actually the ventral side, the belly part of the toad, and the lumbar region is here, the dorsal side. So it is the lumbar, and this is the abdominal side. So we actually have the anus and the sacral hump in the abdominal lumbar region. So we finished the axial region. We now have the appendicular region, which actually composes of the forelimbs and the hind limbs. So starting with our forelimbs, these are the anterior appendages, which is further divided into segments. Again, we have the upper arm, middle arm, carpus or wrist, the manus or hands, the fingers or digits, and the last one here, sorry, it was cut. This is the prepollux. So continuing with our forelimbs, we have actually, so again, the forelimbs are basically the arms of the frog, the two front arms. And so we have the upper arm here. It's also called the brachium. This is the first segment attached to the trunk. And next, we have actually, yes, and we have the middle forearm. This middle forearm is the next segment immediately below the upper arm. And we have the carpus and wrist, which is found next to the forearm. So next to the middle forearm, we have the carpus or wrist over here. Sorry, I meant to say the manus or hand. This is the manus or hand. And next we have the fingers or digits, which are 4 in number. And last is the prepollux, which is the rudimentary first finger, a short stump on the inner side of the hand. So next to the forelimbs, we have the hind limbs in the appendicular region. The hind limbs are the posterior appendages, which are further divided into segments. So first we have the thigh, which is the first segment attached to the body mass, and the shank, which is segment immediately next to the thigh, and next we have the tarsus or ankle, which is the segment immediately next to the shank, followed by the pes or foot, which is the part of the limb distal to the tarsus, and then the toes or digits, which are usually 5 in numbers, and they have webbed feet, which is a membranous extension of the skin connecting one toe to the other. And last, we have the prehallux, which is the small sixth toe, which may be missing, which is why it's not here. So we now finished the external body parts of the toad. We will now proceed to the internal body parts of the toad. So why do we study the toad's anatomy? Studying this would help us in understanding our own body, as the internal parts of the toad is actually related to human anatomy. Anatomy is actually the study of structures or organs that supplement our understanding on bodily functions. So for us to be able to see this internal anatomy, we would have to undergo a skinning and dissecting process for us to be able to see this. So skinning, which is to remove the skin of, and dissecting to expose. And to do that, the toad to be observed will be pinned ventral side up on its limbs, and we will need to make a longitudinal incision through the mid-ventral part of the body wall from the pelvic region to the tip of the lower jaw. Right after, the skin of the toad must be cut to expose the ventral muscles. To spread the body wall, we will cut across the body wall posterior to the forelimbs and anterior to the hind limbs. Posteriorly, we will cut through the rectus abdominis, which is the muscles longitudinal. Right, so we will posteriorly cut through the rectus abdominis, which is the muscles longitudinal near to the midpoint up to the pelvic region. Right after, we will cut the sides to expose the coelemic cavities, but we must also be careful not to cut along the ventral line because we may cut the line alba. We must be careful not to cut the line alba. This is the line at the center of the abdomen. And also be careful not to cut the ventral abdominal vein, which is the blood vessel attached to the abdominal wall found below, because if these two are cut, then it would cause a lot of blood to come out. So finally, after this process, we can now view the internal anatomy of the toad, and we would be able to see the visceral organs. So next, here, so we could see the visceral organs, and after that, we would be able to find the pericardial cavity and the pleuroperitoneal cavity. And in this video, we'll be looking at the different parts. So here we have an overview of the parts we will identify later. So in the pericardial, we have the left and right atrium and the ventricle. The pleuroperitoneal cavity, we have the lungs, liver, gallbladder, stomach, small intestines, pancreas, large intestines, urinary bladder, spleen, kidney, testes, fat ducts, ovaries, and oviducts. So here we have the pericardial cavity. So, in the pericardial cavity, this is actually a small cavity that is located in the thoracic region, and this is the cavity that holds the heart. And in the heart, we can find the left, right atrium and the ventricle. But before we proceed to the parts of the heart is actually enveloped by two transparent membranous tissues. And since we are looking at a toad's heart anatomy, we will find a three-chambered heart. Because toads and amphibians have these kinds of heart, this three-chambered heart is divided into two anterior atria and one posterior ventricle. And in the two anterior atria are the left and right atrium, and the posterior ventricle is just the ventricle. But before we proceed to this, we can recall back on the function of the circulatory system. We already know that the left atrium carries oxygen-rich blood flowing into the arteries, arterioles, and capillaries where there will be gas exchange, and bring back oxygen-poor blood back to the heart, specifically to the right atrium through the venules, veins, and vena cavas. So what we simply need to remember is that the left atrium actually receives oxygenated blood from the lungs, which is carried by the pulmonary veins, and that the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the different organs and is carried by the vena cavae, the pre-cava and the post-cava. Here is the post and here's the pre. And whilst for the one posterior ventricle, this is a cone-shaped ventricle that receives both the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood from the atria. Here's the left, the right atrium, and the ventricle. So next, we will go to our pleuroperitoneal cavity, where most of the organs of the viscera are suspended by their respective mesenteries. So this will be the parts we will identify in the pleuroperitoneal cavity. So an organ we have under the pleuroperitoneal cavity, which is everything here. One, we have the lungs, a paired lungs, which are big thin-walled sacs that function primarily as an organ for breathing. They can be seen either inflated or collapsed. They inflate when we breathe in, and they collapse when we breathe out. Next, we have the liver, which is the largest gland in the body, and this reddish-brown gland in the body is divided into three big lobes: the right lobe, the left lobe, and the median lobe. And they function through the production of bile, which is something that is used to digest fat and it filters our toxins and chemicals. Next, we have the gallbladder, which is a small rounded sac specifically located at the ventral surface of the median lobe of the liver, here. This gallbladder functions as a storage for bile, which was produced again by the liver. Next, we have the stomach, which is a bag-shaped, muscular, slightly curved sac with two regions. The cardiac region and the pyloric region. The cardiac region is the wide anterior portion which connects the esophagus with the stomach. And we have the pyloric region, which is the posterior region located near the pyloric sphincter. Here, this is the stomach, bag-shaped. And the stomach functions in aiding in our chemical digestion by secreting substances and by mechanically breaking down food, and it is also used to store food, and it controls the rate of our passage to the small intestines. Next, we have the small intestines. They are long, thin, irregular, and a yellowish Here we have a long, narrow, coiled tube, which is the small intestines. They have two portions, the duodenum and the ileum. The duodenum is the anterior portion, and the ileum is the posterior portion. The small intestines here have the anterior and we have the posterior portion. The small intestines function in the digestion and absorption of nutrients. Next, we have followed after the small intestines are the pancreas, again, which are the long, thin, irregular yellowish organ, which is suspended on the lesser omentum or the gastrohepaduodenal mesentery. This gastrohepaduodenal mesentery is what connects to the stomach, the liver, and the small intestines. So here we have the pancreas, which functions in the production of pancreatic or digestive enzymes. Next, we have the large intestines here, which are straight and uncoiled, unlike the small intestines, which are coiled. It is also club-shaped, and it continues from the small intestines up to the end at the anus. And the large intestines are usually dark in color. They function by solidifying waste through water absorption and store our waste products. So here we have the urinary bladder, which is a membrane-like bilobed sac ventral to the posterior end of the large intestines. Here. Next, we have the spleen, which is a dark red rounded gland, which is embedded in the mesorectum. This mesorectum is, it suspends the large intestine to the dorsal body wall. And this spleen is actually the largest organ in our lymphatic system, and it functions in the lymphatic system by synthesizing our antibodies through active immune response and through filtering our red blood cells. Next, we have the kidney, which is a flat, elongated, dark brown organ here, which functions in the filtration of our body fluids and the reabsorption of essential ions and nutrients. And it also regulates our acid-base balance and electrolyte concentration. And now we have the last four organs in which two are only found in the male toads and the other two are only found in the female toads. For the organs present in the male toads, we have the testes and the fat ducts or the corpora adiposa. So for our testes, here we have a picture. These are a pair of oval or elongated cylindrical yellowish bodies that lie on the ventral surface of the kidney. So here we have the kidney and on top is the testes. And these are used for reproductive purposes. Next, we have the fat bodies or the corpora adiposa. These that are attached to the anterior end of each of the testes. And again, is also used for reproductive purposes. Last two, we have the parts that are only present in the female toads, which are the ovaries and oviducts. So for the ovaries, these are dark organs that are sometimes filled with eggs. These are ovaries when filled with eggs. But when they are not filled with eggs, they are small, flattened, pale, and irregularly shaped. And they are found attached to the ventral surface of the kidneys again. And they are also used for reproductive purposes. And last, we have the oviducts, which are paired white coiled tubes that are lateral to the kidneys. Oviducts, ovary. To put it simply, they are the pancit canton looking organ that are also used for reproduction. So here are the sources, and that's all.